If you just become the mirror opposite of that which you're opposing, it's not the mirror opposite, it's you become the mere reaction to that which you are opposing, then you will fall prey to the same set of problems. The conservatives are toying with censorship as an answer to the problem of the woke miasma. I do believe that no has to be said to drag queen story hour, but by the same token, as soon as you go down the book forbidding route, you instantly introduce into your own ethos the problem of enabling the censors who are operating by the same principles, in principle, on your side.
I see the anti-woke instinctively going to a position of, well, whatever we're being told is automatically untrue and automatically wrong. And that means that they no longer believe in the concept of truth either. If to you, the truth is the opposite of what the mainstream is saying, you don't believe in truth either. All you believe is in this pointless, destructive battle in which truth and reality no longer exists. And if your claim is that we cannot agree on truth without God, then maybe I'm going to potentially agree with you that that's perhaps what the world needs. Because if you think that's the only way we're going to get around truth, we need something, because right now neither side knows what the truth is.
So you were just at the Oxford Union, and you seem to have managed something approximating a hit as far as those things go. And so what do you think you did right, and why did what you did have the cultural impact it has had? How many people have watched that so far?
It's very difficult to measure because it goes into private Telegram channels, WhatsApp groups, etc. But I'm guessing somewhere between 100 and 200 million at this point. And in terms of why I think it got the resonance that it did, I think there are a few factors. I think the first one is something that you actually discussed with Joe Rogan recently, which is the world's crying out for a positive vision of the future. Those of us who spend a lot of time trying to work out what this craziness was happening in the West and why it was happening, we had to do it from a position of critique and criticism. And we've spent 5 years in our case on trigonometry doing that, and you started earlier. But now I think the world is in a position where it's looking for a positive message. And that is actually one of the things that I tried to do. I tried to persuade people who were there at the Oxford Union at that debate. And I said to them, look, I don't want to talk to those of you who already agree with me. I'm more interested in talking to those of you who may be woke. That was the debate I was invited to participate in, and who are open to rational argument. So I think that was part of it. And the second part of it, Jordan, and again, I think this is something you'll be well aware of. We live in a society in which adults are afraid to tell children what they need to hear. And so I think a lot of people resonated with the fact that this was somebody who was an adult standing up in front of young people and challenging them to be better, as opposed to either pandering to their preconceived beliefs and biases or cowering away from having that debate. So I think those two things combined, plus a rational argument, a few jokes, you throw that in the mix and you've got yourself a good speech.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we could talk about productively on the positive vision front are the comments. We could elaborate on the comments you made in relationship to absolute privation and poverty. And so many people who are watching and listening might not be aware, but there was plenty of doomsaying in the 1960s with regards to the population catastrophe and prognostications on the part of people like Paul Ehrlich, most famously, who wrote The Population Bomb, that by the year 2000, we'd be out of all our primary resources and everyone would be starving. And none of that happened. In fact, primary resources became more plentiful and less expensive. And we have twice as many people on the planet as he was paranoid about in the year 2000. So 8 billion instead of the dreaded 4 billion. And while that's happened, virtually everyone, it's 7 billion out of 8 billion people on the planet now have access to basic resources. And so we've all got richer, and there's a hell of a lot more of us. Now, the apocalyptic moralists who want to save the planet, let's say, still are putting forward the story that what we're doing is not, quote, sustainable, that we need 5 Earths to feed everyone on the planet at the level that the West currently enjoys. And their what would you call, recipe for future progress is a limits to growth model. And The problem with the limits to growth model is, well, first of all, it's hypocritical because the people who are proposing it aren't going to be the people who are suffering from it. That's for sure. And second, it's wrong technically because, and I think you did a good job of pointing this out in the Oxford speech, poor people can't care about long-term sustainability and iterability. They're so busy scrabbling in the dirt for their next meal, trying to get fresh water, access to basic hygiene facilities, the next meal, that anything approximating a medium to long-term vision is out of their reach. And so they sacrifice the future to the present so they can survive. But if you get people up to about $5,000 per year in gross domestic product productivity per capita, they immediately start to take a longer view. And I figured this out about 15 years ago when I was perversely working on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, trying to make them less socialist and destructive than they were. And it looked to me like we could have our cake and eat it too, that the best policy possible to produce a, quote, sustainable planet would be a one that ameliorates poverty, especially on the energy front, as rapidly as possible. So that's part of a positive vision.
I agree completely. And look, I'm by no means a climate expert, but even as just an outside observer, someone whose primary job is podcaster and satirist, I can see that a lot of the narratives that we have, they seem to have more in common with a religious worldview or a cult-like worldview than they do with a practical attempt to solve the real problems that we face. And I was born in the Soviet Union and I've lived all over the world in many poor countries. So, I don't have we talk so much about privilege nowadays in our society, Jordan. We've got male privilege and white privilege and all sorts of other privilege. The main privilege that we don't talk about is Western privilege. And it takes Western privilege to fail to understand that what you just said, which is that poor people don't care about quote unquote saving the planet because they've got more immediate priorities. And so even if you accept the entirety of the climate change argument, and this is the point that I made in the speech, whining about it or reducing consumption in Britain, which produces 1% of global carbon emissions and is responsible for another 1%, so in total 2%, it makes no difference. It will not solve the problem when China and India are busy trying to get their people to avoid starving to death. And so what I see is a kind of doomsday cult that seems to have taken over, and politically we seem to be pandering to that instead of dealing with the real challenges of the world. And by the way, it clearly has impacts all over the place. I mean, if you look at what happened in Germany, Germany, for purely political and ideological reasons, shut down its nuclear power stations. It's now paid South Africa, and Michael Schellenberger covered this on his Substack, paid South Africa to not use coal. Well, now what? Now they import coal back from South Africa and burn it. And also, of course, they made themselves extremely dependent on Russian gas at the time, which I hope the war in Ukraine is something we get on to talking about.
Yes, I hope so too. Well, yeah, so what you get in Germany is the worst, and for all those people who are watching and listening who might have environmental concerns, look, if you have environmental concerns, one of your goals is, in principle, to improve the environment. Now, if you implement a set of policies that make energy 5 times as expensive, which is what's happened in Germany, and you improve things on the pollution front, at least you could say, well, energy is much more expensive, and that's pretty hard on the poor people. But look, we've accomplished one of our own goals. And, you'd have to contend seriously with an opponent who put forward an argument like that. But if the reality on the ground is, well, we made energy 5 times as expensive, we've made ourselves hyper-reliant on the Russians and a single point of failure on the energy front, and we're producing far more pollution, particularly in relationship to coal burning, and the grid is much less reliable than it used to be. It's like, well, you didn't just fail according to my definition of failure. You failed according to your definition of failure. And so how in the world is that even possibly justified? And then I think we get into the religious realm here at that point. And so Alex Epstein has done a pretty good job of laying this out. I like Lomberg on the IPCC front, and we'll get back to that, accepting the idea that there will be something like 2 degrees of climate change in the next 100 years and figuring out what to do with that. But Epstein has pointed out in his new book, Fossil Fuel Future, he laid out something I'd also investigated in my Maps of Meaning book, this underlying religious narrative. And it's basically a Gaia narrative. It's an earth-worshipping metaphysic, and it is a religious in its implicit structure. And the idea is that the planet is a hapless, fragile virgin threatened by a rapacious, consuming, tyrannical giant, and that's society, and that the individual is a parasitical predator riding the back of that rapacious monster. And that is a religious narrative, and it's religious because it's a fundamental narrative that frames everything else, and it also partakes of the archetypal underlying structure that makes religious stories religious. And so you could conjure up an opposite story, right? And this would flesh out the religious landscape. The opposite story would be nature is a hideous Gorgon-like demon who's hell-bent at every aspect to freeze us into terror and devour us. So that's nature red in claw and tooth. Culture is the walled garden. It's the walls of the walled garden that protects us from the absolute ravages of nature. And the human being is a heroic enterpriser bent on entering into a relationship with the planet and with culture that approximates something like environmental stewardship. It's a much more positive vision. Now, it casts nature into disrepute and probably elevates culture to unidimensionally. But you need both sides of that picture in order to have a complete picture of the world. So kids are being offered an incomplete religious view of the world that's focused on nature as hapless virgin. And so everything is being sacrificed to her. And that's complicated by another fact. And Konstantin, I think this has to do with the problem that the conservatives and the liberals, for that matter, real liberals, haven't been able to come up with a promising vision. Is that, well, adolescents enter this period that Jean Piaget called the messianic. Now, not everyone gets to that point, but relatively cognitively sophisticated kids do. And so this is about age 16 to 20, let's say. This is also when you want to induct kids into the armed forces if you actually want to manage it effectively. It's really when their final touches of their enculturation occur. It's when their prefrontal cortexes prune themselves most thoroughly. That happens also between the ages of 2 and 4, but it happens between 16 and 20. You sort of die into your adult self. Anyways, Piaget noted that people of that age, cross-culturally, have a desire to identify with a purpose that transcends themselves, and that would be cultural identity, right? And they need that. They find it in music often. They find it in their subcultures, but they need to be offered that. And there's something heroic about it because they actually do want to look outside themselves. And then, the radical, envious lefties come along and say, well, all you have to do is wave a placard at an oil company, and now you're culture hero of the universe and, standing next shoulder to shoulder with the Messiah himself. And that's pretty damn appalling, and it's certainly not true. But in the absence of an alternative vision, then people are going to gravitate towards that as they do. And so you can't exactly blame young people for that, even though it's tempting. Now, and then there's a narcissistic element too. So one of the things I really like about Bjorn Lomborg, he accepts the IPCC climate projections, 2 degrees in 100 years. He's attempted to model that as decrement in GDP production. So he figures, given current trends, we'll be 400% richer by the year 2100. But then you can knock off some percentage of that because of the costs of climate change. And that'll be non-trivial. I think he basically concludes we'll be like 350% richer instead of 400%. And that's not nothing, but it's by no means a catastrophe. And he's pointed out very clearly too that even in the IPCC reports themselves, there's no looming apocalypse. And the idea that
Jordan, let me
Anyways,
pick up on a couple of those points. Well, a few actually. So, first of all, in terms of this religious worldview, I think one of the other things that's so appealing about it is human beings crave doomsday scenarios. The idea that we're living in some kind of unique moment in human history when the world's about to be destroyed. Whether that's true or not, by the way, is incredibly appealing. That is something that gives your life meaning and purpose, even if your life has no meaning and purpose. And the thing with this woke ideology is that, and this is something I kind of started to notice, my journey into this discussion in general was through comedy. I was a stand-up comedian. And in 2015, 2016 in particular, I started to look around and I just saw a lot of people who seemed for some reason to suddenly hate themselves. Like it was so suddenly normal as a comedian, you spend most of your time backstage listening to other comedians. And out of the blue, you'd start getting these kids in their 20s going on stage and going, well, I'm a white guy, therefore blah, blah, blah. And then they do a bunch of self-deprecating jokes, the premise of which was because they were white, they were evil. And this ideology, I think, is fundamentally about self-hate. And if you hate yourself, well, why wouldn't you crave the punishment that you therefore deserve, right? And I think the doomsday narrative maps so well onto wokeness for that reason as well.